The moment Robert F. Kennedy Jr. finished speaking, the studio erupted. Not in laughter, not in dismissive scoffs, but in thunderous applause. The liberal TV host, who only minutes earlier had been smugly grinning, now sat frozen, his rehearsed talking points utterly useless. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had set this up as an easy win, an opportunity to make RFK Jr. look foolish on live television, to paint him as outdated, radical, and out of touch. But instead, he had walked straight into a trap, and now millions of viewers were watching as he struggled to recover. How did it all go so wrong? Let's go back to the beginning. The studio lights beamed brightly as the cameras began rolling. The audience, carefully curated by the network, had been coached to respond the right way, cheer for the host, scoff at RFK Jr., and ensure that the narrative remained under control. At the center of it all sat Greg Dawson, a longtime liberal news host known for his aggressive interviews and no-nonsense takedowns of conservative and independent figures. Across from him, calm and collected, sat Robert F. Kennedy Jr., dressed in a dark blue suit and a crisp white shirt, exuding the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his life fighting against corruption. Dawson leaned forward, his expression already smug, the flicker of a grin betraying his belief that he had the upper hand. "Mr. Kennedy," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "a lot of people say your views are, well, let's say, controversial. Some even call them dangerous. Would you say that's a fair assessment?" RFK Jr. didn't flinch. "I'd say that's a lazy assessment," he replied smoothly. The audience gave a few awkward chuckles, some surprised by the immediate pushback. Dawson blinked, clearly not expecting that level of confidence right out of the gate. He forced a laugh. "Okay," he said, shifting slightly in his chair. "So let's talk specifics. You've questioned policies that experts and government officials agree are necessary for public safety. Surely you don't think you know better than the experts." RFK Jr. clasped his hands together, his expression thoughtful, not defensive. "The question isn't whether I think I know better," he said. "The question is why you assume the so-called experts are always right." A murmur rippled through the audience. Dawson did not like that answer. "Oh, come on, Robert," he scoffed, shaking his head dramatically. "These are leading scientists, policymakers, some of the brightest minds of our time, and you're saying they could be wrong?" RFK Jr. raised an eyebrow. "I'm saying they've been wrong before, repeatedly, and I think you know that." The audience leaned in, sensing a shift. Dawson let out an exaggerated sigh. "So you're telling me that all these brilliant minds, people with decades of experience, could be just making things up? That seems a little conspiracy-minded. Don't you think?" RFK Jr. let a small smile play on his lips. "You ever heard of the phrase, settled science, Greg?" he asked. Dawson frowned. "Of course." RFK Jr. nodded. "Yeah, so have I. You know when people used to say that? When they claimed the earth was flat?" The room fell dead silent. Dawson's grin flickered for just a second. RFK Jr. continued. "They said the science was settled when doctors insisted smoking was good for you." A few laughs rippled through the audience. "They said the science was settled when major corporations pushed harmful chemicals into our food and water, assuring us it was safe until it wasn't." The audience was now fully engaged, some murmuring in agreement. Dawson's smirk vanished entirely. RFK Jr. leaned forward slightly, his voice steady and composed. "I believe in science. What I don't believe in is blind obedience to people who have been proven wrong, time and time again." A wave of applause rolled through the audience. Dawson was losing control. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. His earpiece crackled with the voice of a producer. "Cut him off. Change the topic." Dawson cleared his throat. All right. Let's move on. I don't want to get stuck on that all night." RFK Jr. smiled knowingly. "Of course you don't." The audience laughed again, louder this time. Dawson's frustration was showing. He needed to recover, needed to get control back. So he switched tactics. "So, Mr. Kennedy, your family has a long legacy in politics, and yet you seem to be distancing yourself from some of their policies. Would your father and uncle be proud of the stances you're taking today?" The question was loaded, designed to put RFK Jr. in a tough spot, questioning his own family's legacy on live television. But if Dawson expected hesitation, he was sorely mistaken. RFK Jr. didn't miss a beat. "I think my father and uncle fought for truth and accountability," he said plainly, "and I think they'd be far more disappointed in those who blindly follow whatever the media tells them to think." The energy in the room shifted again. Dawson opened his mouth, but the applause drowned him out. The audience, the one his network had prepped to mock RFK Jr., was now cheering for him instead. And in that moment, Dawson realized something. He had lost, but the cameras were still rolling, and RFK Jr. was just getting started. The applause in the studio refused to die down. Greg Dawson, once the undisputed king of gotcha journalism, sat visibly rattled, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to control the narrative, dictate the tone, and humiliate RFK Jr. on live television. But instead, he had been exposed. His earpiece crackled violently. "Do something! Take control back!" Dawson forced a strained smile, trying to act as if the last 5 minutes of brutal truth bombs hadn't just completely derailed his career. "All right," he said, raising a hand as if trying to calm the audience. "We've certainly had quite the debate tonight, Robert." RFK Jr. just watched him, completely unbothered, his hands lightly folded on the desk, his composed demeanor unchanged. He had seen this play before. When mainstream media couldn't win a debate, they always pivoted the same way. And Dawson? He was getting desperate. Dawson forced another laugh, but it came out too tight, too rehearsed. "But let's be honest," he said, his voice dropping into a more serious tone. "At the end of the day, you are part of the establishment. You come from one of the most powerful families in American history. So isn't it a little hypocritical for you to paint yourself as an outsider?" It was his last attempt, a final Hail Mary to regain control, and for a brief second, Dawson thought he had him. But RFK Jr. was already prepared. "You know what, Greg?" RFK Jr. said smoothly, his tone casual yet sharp. "You're absolutely right." Dawson blinked. That wasn't the response he expected. "You... what?" Dawson asked, trying to mask his confusion. RFK Jr. nodded. "I was born into a family with influence," he admitted. "A family that fought for justice, truth, and the American people." Dawson stiffened. "And that's exactly why I do what I do," RFK Jr. continued, "because I know what real power looks like." He gestured lightly toward Dawson. "And I also know what fake power looks like." The crowd erupted. Dawson's face froze for half a second, his smile twitching. He was losing them again. RFK Jr. leaned forward slightly, his voice measured and precise. "Let me ask you something, Greg," he said. "Do you know what real power is?" Dawson scoffed, crossing his arms. "Oh, please, enlighten me." RFK Jr. didn't miss a beat. "Real power," he said, "is when you can tell the truth and not be afraid of the consequences." Dawson's face twitched. "You see," RFK Jr. continued, locking eyes with him, "I don't answer to corporations. I don't answer to party leaders. I don't answer to the talking points handed out before this show." He gestured toward the cameras. "But you do, don't you?" The audience gasped. Dawson's smirk vanished. His earpiece crackled frantically. "End this now! Cut to commercial!" But it was too late. The crowd was too loud, the energy too high. Dawson had completely lost control. "You act like you're the voice of the people," RFK Jr. went on, his tone unwavering. "But let's be real." Dawson shifted uncomfortably. "You're just a voice for the corporations that run your network." The audience exploded. Greg Dawson had just been called out on national television. His carefully crafted image of an objective journalist had shattered in real time. Dawson gritted his teeth. He needed an out, a way to stop this before it got worse. So he did what every mainstream media figure did when they were losing a debate. He pivoted to personal attacks. "You know what, Robert?" he said, his tone turning cold. "People say you're passionate. I say you're reckless." RFK Jr. simply raised an eyebrow. "Passion," Dawson continued, leaning forward, "doesn't change facts. And the fact is, a lot of your claims have been debunked." RFK Jr. tilted his head slightly. By whom? Dawson blinked. What? You said my claims were debunked, RFK Jr. repeated, his voice casual but firm. By whom? Dawson opened his mouth, then closed it. You mean by the same institutions I just proved have been wrong over and over again? RFK Jr. continued. The audience laughed. Dawson flushed. This was a disaster. RFK Jr. smiled slightly. You see, Greg, when you don't like what someone says, you call it misinformation. He let a beat pass. But you never actually prove it's false, do you? Dawson's lips pressed into a thin line. He was trapped. He had nothing left. RFK Jr. sat back, his expression completely calm. You know what I think is funny? He mused. Dawson exhaled sharply. I'm sure you're about to tell me. RFK Jr. smiled. You always say you want people to trust the experts. Dawson nodded quickly. Because they're trained professionals. But only the experts who agree with you, RFK Jr. cut in. Dawson froze. The audience erupted again. RFK Jr. nodded. That's not journalism, Greg. That's just corporate-sponsored propaganda. The cheers were deafening. Dawson had completely lost the room. His earpiece screamed, "Cut to commercial! Now!" Dawson's face was flushed red, his hands tight on the desk. He forced a fake smile, his voice strained. Well, Robert, this has certainly been lively, he said through clenched teeth. But unfortunately, we're out of time. RFK Jr. smirked. You always are when the conversation doesn't go your way. The audience roared. Dawson's cheeks burned. The camera feed cut to black. Within minutes, clips of the humiliating interview flooded social media. RFK Jr. destroys liberal host Live on Air. Greg Dawson loses control of his own show. RFK Jr. shuts down corporate media in epic exchange. RFK exposed. The media was trending before the night was over. By the next morning, the mainstream media was scrambling to do damage control. Dawson sat in his corner office, watching the replays in stunned silence. He had spent years building his reputation as the guy who took politicians down. But in just one interview, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had taken him down. His career would never be the same. Meanwhile, RFK Jr. was already moving on. Because this was just the beginning. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to grow. What would you have done if you were in his shoes? Let us know in the comments below.